Welcome to our channel. Right now, you will hear the story that shocked the world and touched the hearts of millions. Imagine a cop on duty, abuse of power, a young, dark-skinned girl, and a crazy act that no one could have predicted. He made her swallow a light bulb. It would seem that this should have been without consequence, since he didn't know who her father was. But this story is not about impunity. It's about justice, courage, and consequences that turn lives upside down. Right now, write in the comments what your name is and from what city or country you are watching this video. It is very important for us to know you better, because each of you makes our channel unique. You're not just viewers. You are our family, our voice, our support. Every one of your likes, comments, and subscriptions helps us tell these important stories to the world. Without you, none of this would be possible. You are incredibly important to us, and it is because of you that we are able to continue our mission. Thank you for being with us. The city, immersed in the usual hustle and bustle of everyday life, had no idea that one act in the shadow of the police station would become a topic for discussion around the world. People hurried about their business. Cars honked endlessly in traffic, and nothing seemed to portend trouble. But there, behind the locked doors, something terrible was happening. Her name was Alicia. She was only 17. She loved to draw, dreamed of becoming a designer, and always carried a notebook with sketches of her fantasy world. That day, she was on her way home from school when a police car with flashing lights pulled up beside her. "Hey, you!" the officer shouted from the window. His voice was rough and demanding. Alicia stopped, stunned. "Me? Is something wrong?" "Show me your papers," the man ordered without getting out of the car. She rummaged through her bag, trying not to be nervous. But something in his gaze, in the way he looked at her, made her heart race. "Is this some kind of search?" "I didn't do anything," Alicia said, trying to remain calm. "I told you, documents." He jumped out of the car, grabbed her bag, pulled out her purse, and started looking for something. "You have no right to do that." Alicia took a step back. But that was only the first step in the nightmare that unfolded next. She was forced into a car. When she asked the officer why she was being detained, he just waved her off, muttering, "We have our reasons." At the station, she was taken to a cold, windowless room. It looked as if every object there had a patina of outdated cruelty on it. There was chipped paint on the walls, a table scratched as if it were the scene from a crime movie, and a bright light bulb that hung directly over Alicia's head. She remained silent until the officer entered. His face was stone, his eyes penetrating her to the bone. "You want to play smart? You think we don't know you're playing tricks on us?" he said, sitting down across from me. "I didn't do anything," Alicia replied firmly. "I was just walking home." "Then why are you so nervous?" His smile was strained, almost predatory. "It's okay to be nervous when I'm being illegally detained," she parried, not averting her gaze. Her insolence enraged the officer. He grabbed a light bulb that was lying on the table and began to twist it in his hands as if thinking. "You know, sometimes people understand better when they're made to feel the weight of their mistakes." "What mistakes? You haven't even told me what you're accusing me of." Her voice trembled, but she didn't give up. What happened next was a living hell. The officer pulled out a light bulb, approached Alicia, and said, "If you want to prove you're honest, swallow this." "What?" Her eyes widened in horror. "This is insane." He didn't give her a chance to refuse. The pressure, the threats, the fear. It all came down on the girl, and she realized that she had no choice. It was a moment that would soon shake the world. A moment that would show how far the abuse of power could go when there was no one to stop it. Alicia remembered everything. The coldness of the glass, the taste of the metal, the feeling of pain and humiliation. But she didn't know then that this act would be the beginning of not only her nightmare, but a battle for justice that would change everything. The room in which Alicia sat seemed like a trap, the air growing heavier by the minute. The light bulb on the table in front of her was a strange symbol of her helplessness. The officer, whose name she never learned, continued to glare at her. There was no humanity in his eyes, only cold superiority. "You think I'm kidding?" he said, holding the bulb as if it were a simple toy. "I told you exactly what to do. This is crazy." Her voice shook, but she tried to resist. "You have no right." "Right?" He grinned, his face contorted with irritation. "This is where I decide who has rights. Do you know why you're here now? Because you're one of them." One of who? Alicia felt her hands begin to tremble, but she tried not to show fear. "Don't pretend you don't understand." The officer moved closer, resting his hands on the table. "You're all the same. Cunning, deceitful. You think the laws protect you? You think you can walk our streets like you own everything? Ours?" Alicia lifted her chin, her voice harder. "You're not even hiding the fact that it's hate. But I'm not going to keep quiet." He straightened up, clasping the bulb in his hand, and laughed, though there wasn't an ounce of mirth in his laughter. "You're not going to keep quiet? Who's going to hear you? Nobody cares about you. You think anyone's going to listen to a little girl like you?" Alicia knew he was wrong, but at that moment she felt all alone. She thought about her family, about what her father would say if he found out. But fear overshadowed everything else. "You know," the officer leaned toward her, his voice becoming a whisper, "people like you should know their place. If you'd just walked by, nothing would have happened, but you decided to open your mouth. You detained me for no reason." Alicia raised her head sharply. "You only use your power to make yourself feel powerful." That was the moment when the officer lost the last vestiges of his composure. He grabbed her arm and threw the light bulb in front of her with force. The glass clattered loudly on the table. "You want to prove you're not lying? Do it. Swallow it. Are you trying to kill me?" Alicia couldn't believe what was happening. "No one will kill you if you do what I say. You chose this path." Fear and anger struggled inside her. She knew it wasn't just cruelty. It was a message he wanted to send to anyone who, like her, dared to disobey. In that moment, Alicia realized that this was no random incident. This was a demonstration of power. His look said one thing: "You are not like me. You don't deserve respect or protection." She remembered her father's lessons, his stories of how he himself had faced injustice because of the color of his skin. "Hold your head high," he'd said. "Never let them make you think you're less than them." But how do you hold your head high when you're being broken? The officer loomed over her again. "You either swallow this, or I'll make sure no one even knows where you are. You understand me?" Alicia was desperate. She looked at the door, at the walls, as if hoping someone would burst in and stop this nightmare. But there was no one. Just this man, his cold hatred, and a glass bulb that seemed like a weapon. "You know what the worst part is?" She looked into his eyes, trying not to cry. "You think you've won. Isn't that right?" He smirked, tilting his head. That moment was the point of no return. He had made his mistake. He didn't know who her father was, and he didn't realize that behind those closed doors began a story that would shatter his impunity. But, for now, Alicia didn't know that. All she saw was cruelty soaked in hatred, and she realized that this incident would not be something she could simply forget. It would change everything. Alicia has always been someone who sees beauty even in the grayest of places. She grew up in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where cracks in the asphalt became her canvases and abandoned buildings became her inspiration. Her father, Daniel, often said, "You have a talent for seeing the world not as it is, but as it could be." Her life was not easy, but she never complained. Her father worked as a mechanic and tried to provide everything she and her younger brother Cameron needed. Alicia was used to hearing about the injustices her father and grandfather faced from a young age. "In our world, sweetheart, you'll have to work twice as hard to prove your worth," Daniel said when Alicia was 10. "But remember, you're no less than anyone else. Don't ever forget that." She took his words as a guide to action. Alicia had always been one of the best students in school. She painted posters for school events, helped out at a local homeless shelter, and dreamed of going to art college. Her dreams were big but simple. She wanted to open a design studio where she could help kids in her neighborhood explore their creativity. Her room was full of drawings. On the walls hung sketches of people, landscapes, and things she wanted to create. She was the kind of person who found joy in even the smallest moments of life. But there was a shadow behind that inner light. She saw how the world treated people like her. One day, when she was 15, she was walking from the store with a bag of groceries. A group of boys on the corner shouted something after her. It wasn't just rude, it was humiliating. She tried to ignore it until one of them got too close. "Why are you walking around like you're important?" he said, grinning. "Just going home," she replied, trying not to look him in the eye. "You shouldn't be here. This is not your place. This episode sticks in her memory." Her father found her at home, sitting on her bed with a book in her hands, but with a blank stare. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down next to me. "Why are they allowed to talk like that?" Her voice trembled. "Why do they think I'm not like them?" Daniel sighed heavily and put his arm around her shoulders. "Because they're afraid. Afraid that you might be better than them. Afraid that their power disappears when you find yours." That conversation changed her. From then on, Alicia decided that she would fight for her place in the world. She couldn't change the past, but she could make sure that her future wasn't held hostage to other people's prejudices. On the day she was stopped by the policeman, she was on her way home from school. She had just finished working on a project for a school competition, a mural that depicted the unity of people of different races. She was full of joy and hope, thinking about how she would show the work to her father. She had no idea that a few minutes spent outside would change her life forever. Alicia had always known that the world could be cruel, but she believed she could handle it. However, sitting in the cold room of the police station, she felt her dreams crumble one by one. "Why me?" she asked herself. "Why do I have to prove that I'm human?" Her story was important not only because of who she was, but because she could have been any of us. Her light, her dreams, her aspirations for a better world, all fell victim to a system that saw her only as an object to be suppressed. But Alicia wasn't just a victim. Her strength, built up from years of upbringing and fighting injustice, would begin to show. The moment she thought all was lost, determination began to grow inside her. This chapter of Alicia's life was about who she was before the fateful day, but her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The policeman who stood in front of Alicia did not look like a man questioning his actions. There was no hint of pity on his face, no shadow of doubt. He was a predator who felt himself at the top of the chain of power, protected by a uniform and a system that allowed him to act with impunity. His name was Officer Craig Manson. He had a long career behind him, filled with complaints that never made it to court. His co-workers knew him as a tough and principled man who believed in discipline at all costs. But beneath that facade lurked the real problem, a contempt for those he considered others. On the day he had detained Alicia, he had acted on his usual pattern. He didn't need any reason. For him, the color of her skin was reason enough. "They're always hiding something," he repeated to his colleagues when one of them questioned his methods. "You just dig deeper and the truth will come out." But in Alicia's case, there was no truth to dig up. She was an innocent girl who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, that didn't matter to Manson. He needed to prove that he was in control of the situation. In the interrogation room, he walked slowly around her as if enjoying her fear. He had already decided he was going to break her. This wasn't about law or justice. It was about power, his power. "You think you can speak to me as an equal?" he said, taking the bulb in his hands again. "Do you think you're like me?" Alicia tried to object, but her voice trembled. "I don't think I'm like you. I'm better." Her words hurt him. His face tensed and his eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a girl in front of him. This was a challenge to his authority, and he couldn't stand it. "Better, you say?" He laughed, but there was hatred in his laughter. "Then show it to me." He placed the bulb in front of her and bent slightly to be at her eye level. "Come on, prove your point." Alicia recoiled. "You can't make me do that. It's not legal. It's crazy." "The law?" He slapped his hand on the table, making her wince. "I'm the law here." He took the bulb, leaned closer, and said in a slow, squeezed voice, "It won't kill you if you do it right. But if you don't, well, it's not my fault you didn't listen." His words were utterly indifferent to her life. She was nothing to him. Her fear was his triumph. At that moment, he didn't even realize that he was becoming the embodiment of a system that not only allowed, but encouraged such actions. "You have no right," Alicia shouted, but her voice was already losing strength. "And you try to prove I have or I haven't," he hummed, taking a step back. Manson knew his power was secure. He had no fear of repercussions. Complaints against him disappeared from reports. Witnesses were silenced. And even if someone tried to speak up, the system was always on his side. But this time was different, though he didn't know it yet. He didn't know that this incident would be the beginning of his downfall. Alicia wasn't just a random victim. Her father was someone who knew how to fight injustice and was willing to do so without fear of risk. But so far, Manson had only seen a girl he thought was weak, and he decided that this incident would be further proof of his strength. He had done something that even in his system would be hard to justify. He made her swallow a light bulb. Alicia's screams echoed through the corridors of the station, but no one came. Her humiliation was complete. For him, it was just another incident he could forget. For her, it was a moment that changed her life forever. Manson's brutality wasn't an accident. It was a symptom of a system that allowed men like him to exist. But this incident will not go unnoticed. This act will be the point at which he loses everything. The police station room was already empty. Alicia sat on the cold floor with her hands on her knees. She couldn't understand why and for what they had done to her. Her throat stung. It hurt to speak, but something stronger than fear was brewing inside. It was anger, a powerful, destructive anger that promised things wouldn't stay the way they were. But what she didn't know was that her father was already on his way to her. Daniel Rivers, her father, was no ordinary man. To most people in the neighborhood, he was a mechanic, a small garage owner who repaired cars and did it with a smile on his face. But Daniel had a past that only a few knew about, a past of fighting for the rights of people like his daughter. He didn't just know what it meant to face injustice, he had dedicated his life to fighting it. When Alicia didn't come home on time, he began to worry. Her phone didn't answer, and his heart clenched treacherously with foreboding. So he called the police. "My daughter is missing." His voice was calm but tense. Alicia Rivers, 17 years old. She was last seen at the center. The duty officer who answered the phone mumbled something inaudible. But then there was a twist. When he heard the name Rivers, his voice changed. "We'll check it out," he replied with unexpected reverence. "Wait on the line." A few minutes later, Daniel heard that his daughter had been detained without explanation. At the police station, the officers were getting nervous. When Daniel Rivers's name appeared in Alicia's file, the news spread like wildfire through the corridors. One of the junior officers ran up to Manson, who was just finishing his coffee in the break room. "Hey, that case of the girl you picked up, do you know who her father is?" His voice was shaking. Manson frowned. "So what of it?" "It's Daniel Rivers," the junior officer almost shouted. "Haven't you heard of him?" Manson wasn't the type to lose confidence easily, but that name jogged something in his memory. Rivers, an activist, a man who'd fought the system for years and won. He didn't just speak out about injustice. He ruined the careers of those who allowed it. He was known far beyond the city limits, and his name was even heard in federal courts. "So?" Manson squeezed out, though his voice was less confident. "This guy destroys people like you," the junior officer replied, taking a step back. "He doesn't just make a fuss. He knows people. Important people." "Shit," Manson hissed, clenching his fists. Daniel, meanwhile, was already in the driveway. His face remained impenetrable, but inside him a hurricane was raging. He remembered the conversations he'd had with his daughter, how he'd always told her not to be afraid of the system. And now he felt guilty that he couldn't protect her. But that guilt was turning into a firm resolve. He walked into the station with the look of a man who is not ready to take no for an answer. "Where is my daughter?" His voice was cold and flat. The officer at the counter looked confused. "Sir, she's in the—" "Don't make me say it again." Daniel interrupted him, and there was menace in his voice. After a minute, Alicia was led out. She was pale and red-eyed, but when she saw her father, she was relieved. "Daddy." Her voice was hoarse. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, hugging her gently. But when he looked at the officer accompanying her, his eyes turned icy. "Who did this?" "Yeah, I can't say," Alicia whispered. Daniel didn't insist. He turned to the counter, where a group of officers were now gathered. "I want to know who was responsible for this. And I want to know now." The story began to grow. Daniel Rivers' name started making the news. Activists, journalists, and even politicians got involved. For Manson, it meant one thing: the end of his career. But he didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning of his problems. This incident, which he thought was a small thing, was a thunderclap to the entire system that allowed people like him to exist. Daniel Rivers was someone who didn't just fight. He destroyed injustice to its very foundation. Now that he knew his daughter was a victim of the very system he had fought against all his life, he wasn't about to stop. The news that the daughter of prominent human rights activist Daniel Rivers had been humiliated and abused at the police station spread like wildfire. In the morning, when Alicia was still recovering at home, journalists were already gathering outside her window. Cameras, microphones, flashes, everyone wanted to hear her story. "Minus Mr. Rivers. How are you going to respond?" shouted one of the reporters. "Are you going to sue?" continued the other. Daniel stepped out onto the porch. His face was hard, his eyes burning with determination. "We will fight for justice," he said. "And not just for my daughter. We will fight for everyone who has suffered under a system that covers up abuse." His words hit the news headlines within an hour, but the real storm began on social media. Beginning of movement. Someone who heard Alicia's story posted the post on Twitter. 17-year-old Alicia Rivers was forced to swallow a light bulb at the police station. Her fault, her skin color. When will it stop? You justice for Alicia. The post garnered thousands of reposts in a matter of hours. Facebook and Instagram users posted their stories of police brutality, tagging the hashtag #JusticeForAlicia. Videos calling for justice started appearing on TikTok. One user wrote, "My sister was detained without reason 3 years ago. She was only released after we made a fuss. But what happens to those who don't have connections like Daniel Rivers? We must fight for Alicia and for all of us." Protests in the streets. Soon, protests began in the city. People who had never been seen at rallies before took to the streets with placards. No more violence. Justice for Alicia is justice for all. We are not afraid. A crowd of several thousand people gathered in one of the central squares. They chanted Alicia's name, demanding answers from the police. People lit candles, read poems, and shared their stories. "It's not just about her," one protester told a reporter. "It's about all of us. We are tired of being afraid. Media connects." On the morning of the third day after the incident, major national publications published articles detailing what had happened. News anchors invited Daniel for interviews. "Minus Mr. Rivers, what do you make of the fact that Officer Manson has not yet been suspended?" a major network anchor asked. "That's typical of a system that protects its own," he replied. "But that doesn't mean we're going to stay silent. This is just the beginning." Confrontation on the internet. But amid the general outrage, there were those who tried to justify the actions of the police. There were messages in the comments. "She did something if she was detained." "The police are protecting us. Stop making enemies out of her." These words caused even more outrage. The people who supported Alicia responded with facts, exposing the lies and reminding them how many times such cases had happened before. Videos from the protests, the words of Alicia, who was supported on camera by her father, and the stories of other victims began to fill news feeds. The issue of police reform once again became a central topic of discussion in the country. Payback for Manson. The police station where Officer Manson served became the center of attention. Crowds began to gather outside the building. People brought photos of Alicia, wrote on the pavement with chalk, "We will not forget. Justice must be done." Officers inside the precinct began to get nervous. One of them even sent a message to the press. Manson was always troubled. A lot of us knew it, but were afraid to speak up. That leak was the final straw. A few days after the protests began, Manson was suspended. But that wasn't enough for the people. "Suspension?" Daniel said at the press conference. "It's not a punishment. We demand that he be brought to justice for his actions." Social movement. Alicia's story has become a movement. She became a symbol of the fight against police brutality. Her pictures, with her smile, with her drawings, spread around the world. People posted images of her with captions like, "Alicia is all of us. We will not stop." This storm of public outrage attracted the attention of even the most senior figures. Politicians began to speak out about the need for reform. A movement for justice was growing in the streets, and no one could stop what had begun with a single violent act. But for Alicia and her father, it wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for dignity, for the right to be heard. And now, as people stood shoulder to shoulder, they knew. Their voices would no longer be silenced. Alicia's story, which began as an act of inhuman cruelty, became the epicenter of public outrage. But for her family, it wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a personal mission to disrupt the system that allowed this to happen. Daniel Rivers knew from the start that he would have to act quickly. He assembled a team of his longtime associates, human rights activists, lawyers, and activists. Among them was Sarah Cambridge, a prominent lawyer who had won cases against the police. Her name struck fear into the hearts of many who tried to cover up their misdeeds. "We're not just going to fight," Sarah said at her first meeting with Daniel. "We're going to make them regret ever touching your daughter." The first step was to gather evidence. Daniel secured a meeting with the chief of the police station where the incident had occurred. He was clearly nervous, despite his strained smile. "We are investigating this case, Mr. Rivers," said the station master, rubbing his hands together. "I assure you, justice will be done." "It's not just a case," Daniel replied coldly. "It's the system you're protecting. I'm not here for words. I'm here for action." Meanwhile, Sarah and her team began working with journalists and community organizations. They gathered testimony from Officer Manson's other victims, many of whom had been afraid to speak for years. One of the men, an elderly store owner, said, "He threatened me. Said if I opened my mouth, my business would burn down. I thought I'd have to live with that for the rest of my life." These words were heard at a press conference organized by Daniel's team. Alicia, despite her pain and injury, decided to speak. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said, looking directly into the camera. "No one should be afraid to live because of the color of their skin." Her words sent a powerful message to thousands of people. Human rights organizations, inspired by her courage, launched a campaign to collect signatures to prosecute Manson. In less than a week, the petition garnered more than 1 million signatures. Meanwhile, Sarah demanded full access to the station's CCTV footage. When the police initially refused to provide the footage, she filed a formal lawsuit. The court ordered that the footage be handed over immediately. The video footage showed Alicia being dragged into the room. The sound was poorly audible, but it was enough to realize that everything had happened as she had said. It was a blow to the reputation of the precinct. Even those who tried to justify the police's actions began to question it. Officer Manson, meanwhile, went into hiding. He was given a suspension, but public pressure forced the authorities to act. Charges of abuse of authority, bodily harm, and human rights violations were brought against him. But Daniel knew it wasn't enough. He realized that punishing one person would not change the system. He began organizing roundtables to discuss police reforms, mandatory use of cameras, and independent audits of law enforcement. Together with other activists, he drafted a bill that would change the way police brutality was investigated. "This is just the beginning," he said at every speech. "We will not stop until we see real change." Public support grew. Every action of Alicia's family was accompanied by thousands of comments and messages on social networks. People came to rallies with posters bearing Alicia's words, "No one should be afraid to live." Though the struggle was only in full swing, a sense of change was in the air. The Rivers family had begun a journey that promised not only justice for Alicia, but hope for thousands of others affected by the system. They were no longer alone. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the community was ready to come together to say, "Enough is enough." Alicia's story was not just a tragic case, but a mirror that reflected a much broader problem: systemic racism entrenched in law enforcement. People who had previously been silent began to talk about how the police are not just law and order, but a mechanism that often works against certain groups of people. One of the rallies organized by Daniel's team featured Marcus Wilson, a sociology professor whose research on racism in law enforcement has long been debated in academic circles. "Alicia's case is not an exception," he began, looking out at the crowd. "It is the rule. The police system was built to protect power, not people. When Officer Manson decided to humiliate Alicia, he didn't act alone. His act was a product of a system that teaches that some lives are less important than others." Daniel, who was standing nearby, nodded, supporting the professor's words. He took the microphone. "I've seen it throughout my life," he said. "My father struggled with the same thing. I struggle with it. And now my daughter is. How many generations have to pass before we stop it?" The crowd responded with loud shouts of, "Not one more! Not one more!" Backstage, Daniel's team was preparing for the next step, a public debate with the police. Sarah Cambridge sat with Daniel and Alicia at the round table. "We need to show that this is not an isolated incident," Sarah said. "We need data, statistics, other people's stories. We need to prove that this is a systemic problem, not one person's personal misbehavior." "I can tell my story," Alicia said suddenly. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, looking worriedly at his daughter. "Yes, Dad. If I don't tell, someone else will, and I want people to hear the truth from me." At the debate, police representatives tried to justify themselves. Colonel Michaels, head of the local department, took the floor. "We are not condoning Officer Manson's actions," he said. "This was an isolated incident, and we are doing everything we can to investigate it." Alicia couldn't hold back a sarcastic smile. She raised her hand to speak. "Tell me, Colonel, how many of these isolated cases have you investigated in the last year?" Her voice was firm. The colonel faltered, but Sarah put in, "Answer the question, sir. If this is an isolated incident, why have we been able to find over 20 complaints against Officer Manson in the last 5 years? The hall buzzed. The colonel tried to reply, but his words were drowned in the noise. Alicia raised her hand again, and everyone fell silent. "I want to know," she said, looking straight at him, "why, when I walked into this station, I was not a human being, but something to be humiliated. Can you answer that?" The colonel found no words. This silence was proof that the problem was much deeper than anyone was willing to admit. This debate was a turning point. People realized that Alicia's case is a symptom of a disease that affects society as a whole. In the evening, thousands of posts appeared on social networks calling for reform. People posted their stories with the hashtag #system not broken, #system designed this way. Silence was no longer an option. Alicia did not dare to speak publicly about what had happened for a long time. Every time she closed her eyes, the same fear came over her again. The cold of the room, the light bulb on the table, the officer's voice making her feel like nothing. But she knew that silence was what people like him counted on. They always hoped victims would be afraid to speak up. One night, as the protests began to subside and the news about Manson began to lose steam, she realized that her voice could be the spark that would ignite a new wave. "Daddy, I want to perform," she said over dinner as her family discussed next steps. Daniel froze, placing his fork on the table. "Are you sure? This could be difficult." "Yes." Her voice was firm. "I want people to hear me. I'm not afraid anymore." A few days later, thousands of people gathered in the city's central square. Alicia stood on the stage, the center of attention, but this time she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a fighter. "That day I felt that to them I was not human," she began, holding the microphone with both hands. "I was something to be humiliated, broken, destroyed." The crowd froze. People listened to her as if mesmerized. I could keep quiet. I could hide. But you know what? Silence is what they want. They want us to be afraid. They want us to forget. Her voice deepened, filled with confidence. "But I won't forget. And I won't let them forget." Alicia looked out into the crowd, her gaze hard and direct. "I'm not just standing here for me. I'm standing here for everyone who couldn't speak, for those they broke, for those who are no longer with us." The crowd erupted in applause, but she continued. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. I want it to stop. And we can do that. Together." After the performance, she became a symbol of the movement. People wrote her letters and sent her their stories. Her voice inspired others, and she began to feel that her pain had meaning. She spoke at press conferences, addressed school children, and participated in awareness campaigns. One day, while speaking at a university where students from all over the city had gathered, Alicia answered a question from a young girl who rose from her seat and, trembling, asked a question. "How did you find the strength to speak after everything that happened?" Alicia smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "I realized that if not me, then who? If we all stay silent, nothing will change. Fear is a weapon, but I decided my voice was stronger." Each of her performances was another step on the road to healing. Alicia no longer felt like a victim. She became a leader, a symbol of strength and hope for all who faced injustice. Her courage not only inspired thousands, but also reminded her that she was stronger than she thought. After Alicia's performance and immense public pressure, local authorities could no longer ignore what was happening. Alicia's case became a catalyst for issues that had been silenced for years. People demanded not only justice for her, but also profound changes in the system itself. And the first step was the suspension of Officer Manson. However, this did not appease the public. Daniel and his team continued to insist that one officer was not enough. They demanded a review of the entire system, from police procedures to the laws that allowed such abuses. At the downtown rally, Sarah Cambridge, Alicia's attorney, took the microphone. "We see that firing one police officer is not a solution. It's a cover-up. If we don't change the system, tomorrow there'll be another Manson, and the day after that, another one. We demand reform." Her words became a manifesto for the movement. The authorities began to feel that they were losing control. First win: mandatory body cameras for police officers. One of the first demands of the protesters was to make it mandatory for all police officers to wear body cameras. The public insisted on transparency, arguing that if such cameras had worked, Alicia's case would never have happened. At the city council meeting, which was broadcast live, police officials tried to resist. "It's expensive," one of them said, "and it will make our job harder." But Daniel didn't let them get away with it. He stood up and said firmly, "Expensive? Do you know how much a human life is worth? How much is the trust you've broken worth? People want to see what you're doing. If you have nothing to hide, cameras shouldn't be a problem." This argument was irrefutable. A month later, the city council approved the mandatory wearing of body cameras for all police officers, reviewing complaints against officers. When it was revealed that Manson had received more than 20 complaints against him over the past 5 years, the public was furious. These complaints were ignored or closed without investigation. "This is not just a mistake," Sarah Cambridge said at a press conference. "It's a deliberate cover-up, and it should not go unpunished." Public pressure led to the creation of an independent commission that began reviewing old cases. It found that more than half of the complaints against officers in the local police did not get through. People who had previously been afraid to speak out began to file new complaints, knowing that their voices would now be heard. De-escalation and racial sensitivity trainings. Another important step was the introduction of mandatory training for police officers. These trainings were intended to teach officers how to deal with conflicts in a non-violent and culturally sensitive manner when dealing with different communities. In one of the trainings that journalists recorded, one of the young officers stood up and asked, "Why do we even have to go through this? We're doing our job." The instructor, without losing his composure, replied, "Your job is to protect people, not humiliate them. If you don't understand that, you don't belong in this uniform." The moment went viral on the internet and further strengthened public opinion on the need for reform. A national wave of change, Alicia's case, and the reforms initiated in her city became a model for other regions. Journalists called it the Rivers Effect. In other states, activists began organizing their own campaigns for police reforms inspired by her story. "Alicia proved that one voice can change the system," said Marcus Wilson, a sociologist speaking at the national conference. But this is only possible when thousands of other voices join that cry, resistance, and further struggle. Of course, not everyone accepted the changes. Many police representatives and their supporters tried to resist the reforms, claiming that they undermine the authority of law enforcement. But each of their statements only strengthened the movement. "Don't you want reform?" said Alicia at another rally. "So you want people like me to continue to suffer? We don't agree on that anymore." Slow but inevitable progress change did not happen overnight. It was a slow and difficult struggle, but thanks to Alicia's strength, the support of her family, and thousands of people inspired by her courage, the system began to change. Alicia's case was now not just a tragedy, but the starting point for a new era, an era where abuses of power could no longer be hidden under a cloak of silence. Alicia's story ended not in the courtroom where Officer Manson received his sentence, or even in the laws that began to change across the country. Her story ended in the hearts of people who realized that resilience is not just about survival, but about turning pain into strength, fear into action, and injustice into change. Standing in the very square where the protests began, Alicia addressed the crowd one last time. "We didn't beat the system. We started to change it. We proved that even one voice can be echoed by millions. Never forget, the power is not in those who rule, but in those who fight. Her words were drowned in applause. People cried, hugged, believed. Alicia's story became a symbol that hope can overcome even the darkest times if it is fought for together.